When Shaquille O'Neal saw a little girl running frantically toward his car, he thought she might be lost or in some kind of trouble. But as she got closer, tears streaming down her face, and uttered 4 chilling words, everything changed completely. His heart raced as he realized he had to act immediately, because this wasn't just helping a lost child, this was saving a life. Before we dive into the story, let us know where you're watching from, and if you believe in standing up for those who need help, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss out on meaningful stories. The biting cold of the winter morning covered the quiet suburban street in a misty haze. The streets were deserted, the houses silent under the weak early sunlight. Shaquille O'Neal cruised down the street in his shiny black Cadillac Escalade, the engine quietly growling as he gently pressed the gas pedal. Today, he was on his way to a charity event at the local elementary school, a day that seemed like any other, but he had no idea that his life was about to cross paths with the fate of a child. He pressed the steering wheel heater button, his eyes absently looking at the quiet street ahead. But suddenly, a small figure darted out from an alley by the road. Reacting swiftly, Shaq slammed the brakes. The massive SUV screeched, its tires grinding against the pavement, creating a deafening squeal. A small, frail girl, wearing a thin coat and staggering as if she had been running for miles. Her breath was rapid, her face red from the cold and fear. Her big, watery eyes waved her hands frantically toward Shaq's car. He rolled down the window, his voice calm yet firm. "Hey, kid, what's going on?" The girl froze, her hands trembling as she clung to the car door. Tears streamed down her face, her sobs choking in her throat. "Please, don't make me go home. My dad will hurt me if I tell." Shaq's heart tightened. The bruise on the little girl's wrist didn't escape his sharp eyes. A wave of unease surged within him. This wasn't just a child running away out of anger. This was a child crying for help. He opened the car door, his voice slow but decisive. "Get in, kid. I'll help you." The girl hesitated for a second, then climbed in, her small hands gripping the leather seat, her breath trembling. Shaq closed the car door, the engine roared, and he knew. Today, his life had just taken a completely new direction. Shaq gently closed the car door, his gaze still fixed on Emily's pale face. The little girl was huddled in her seat, her tiny hands gripping each other tightly, turning white with fear. Even though she was in the car with him, she was still trembling, her breath quick and shallow as if she were still being chased. Shaq's instincts told him that this was not just a temporary fear from a child. It was the panic of someone who knew they were in danger. He pulled out his phone, his finger swiftly scrolling through contacts and dialing Madeline Hall, the social worker at the local elementary school. When she answered, his voice was deep but firm. "Madeline, I'm taking a little girl to school. She just escaped from home and shows signs of abuse." There was a brief silence before Madeline's voice came through, filled with concern. "Are you sure? Has she said who hurt her?" Shaq glanced at Emily, who was still clutching the seat, her lips pressed tight as if struggling against her own terror. He gently placed a large hand on her shoulder, offering her warmth and a sense of safety. "Kid, who scared you so much?" Emily looked up, her eyes glistening with tears, her voice a soft whisper as if every word had to fight through her deep fear. "My dad." Just 2 simple words, but they made Shaq's body tense, his jaw clenching. He had heard many heartbreaking stories, but when those words came from a thin child with visible bruises on her wrists, it wasn't just a story anymore. It was reality. and that reality was colder than any winter wind. "Something's definitely wrong. I'll take her to school right away," Shaq said, his voice lowering slightly, as though the rage within him was being held back by all the calm he could muster. The Cadillac Escalade sped down the empty street, every passing road a reminder that Shaq was heading into a situation that could change his life in ways he hadn't anticipated. When the car stopped at the school gate, Shaq opened the door, but Emily remained seated, clinging tightly to his sleeve, her wide, terrified eyes, as if afraid that as soon as he left, she would be pulled back to the place she had just escaped from. "Don't leave me." Her voice was so small it almost melted into the air, but to Shaq it was heavier than any cry for help. He leaned down, his large hand holding onto her tiny, trembling ones, his voice deep, slow, but certain, like an unbreakable promise. "I won't let anyone hurt you." She stared at him for a long moment, as if trying to find trust in his deep eyes. Finally, she nodded, though her small hands still wouldn't release him as they walked into the school. Madeline Hall was waiting in the office, along with Laura Jenkins, a CPS worker. Both women, well versed in dealing with abused children, immediately recognized the panic on Emily's face was no ordinary fear. When Madeline approached and gently sat down across from Emily, the little girl immediately pulled back, clutching Shaq's sleeve, her body tense, like a small bird trapped in a corner. "No, don't take me back home. My dad will find out." Shaq could feel the primal fear in Emily's trembling voice. It wasn't the tantrum of a child angry at her parents or the panic from being punished, but real fear. The kind of fear only a child who had witnessed something they should never have seen would know. David Carter, Emily's father, was no ordinary man. He was tall, with an almost attractive appearance, angular features, and cold, sharp eyes. To outsiders, he was a dedicated single father, working hard to provide for his little daughter after his wife, Sarah Carter, left a year ago. He told the neighbors that she couldn't handle the pressures of family life and disappeared without a trace. No one questioned it, no one doubted it, but Emily knew the truth. She had seen something that fateful night. She never spoke of it, didn't dare to bring it up, but the fear clung to her every night, preventing her from sleeping, from forgetting what had happened. She knew that if she spoke out, if she revealed even a little, her father would find her. And then she would vanish, just like her mother. Shaq leaned against the wall, watching as Laura tried to comfort Emily. An odd feeling stirred inside him, as though a storm was forming right before his eyes, but no one had noticed yet. His unease grew when he pulled out his phone and saw a strange text message that had just arrived. "Better stay out of this." He frowned, narrowing his eyes. He looked up, glancing at Emily still shaking in the corner of the room. He no longer had any doubts. This wasn't just a case of child abuse. This was a deadly secret. Shaq stepped out of the school office, but the images of Emily still clung to his mind. The tiny, trembling girl huddled in the corner of the room like a trapped bird, her eyes constantly scanning the space as though afraid that, at any moment, some invisible hand would reach out and pull her back to the darkness she had just escaped. The whispers from the girl about her violent father, the chilling threat that he'll find her if she tells anyone, echoed in his head. Sitting behind the wheel of the Cadillac Escalade, Shaq couldn't shake the growing unease in his chest. This wasn't just a case of simple abuse. There was something bigger, darker, lurking behind the doors of the Carter house, something that even an 8-year-old could understand. She wasn't allowed to speak out. He didn't drive home. Instead, he veered toward the neighborhood where Emily had run away from this morning. The SUV passed by quiet streets, neat rows of houses, warm lights glowing through windows. From the outside, it looked like a peaceful place, but Shaq knew that sometimes darkness hid beneath the most ordinary surfaces. As he slowly approached the Carter house, he saw David Carter standing by the roadside, acting furtive, pulling a large, heavy bag toward the trunk of his car. The way he looked around, the haste in his movements made Shaq tense with suspicion. He was wearing a faded shirt, sleeves rolled up to his elbows, with his angular face clearly showing the veins at his temples, as if he were trying to suppress a wave of anger. Sweat beaded on his forehead despite the chilly morning air. The way he bent over, struggling to shove the heavy bag into the trunk and quickly slamming it shut, only heightened Shaq's doubts. No further signs were needed. His protective instinct kicked in, and a sense of urgency pushed him to act. He pulled out his phone and dialed Mike Anders, an old friend and a seasoned detective. Mike picked up after the first ring. "I've got a bad feeling about this," Shaq said, his voice lowered, as though anyone could be listening. "Where are you?" Mike's tone immediately turned serious. "In front of the Carter house. I just saw him pull a large bag into the trunk and he seemed tense. Emily said he'd find her if she told anyone. I think she might have seen something he doesn't want anyone to know about." Mike inhaled deeply through the phone. "Shaq, if what you're saying is true, this may not just be a case of child abuse. We might be dealing with something much more serious." Shaq squinted at the house. The living room curtains were drawn, but the light spilling through the gap suggested someone was moving inside. "Could it be his wife didn't actually leave like he said?" Shaq asked, his voice deep, the words heavy as if stones were falling around him. Mike paused for a few seconds, then responded cautiously. "If that's true, we're dealing with someone far more dangerous than we thought." Shaq felt a chill run down his spine, even though the car's heating system was on. A man capable of hurting his wife while maintaining a perfect facade in society. A man who could make the whole neighborhood believe he was just a poor, single father. And worst of all, a man willing to do anything to keep his secrets safe. David Carter wasn't just an abuser, he could be a real monster. Shaq sat in the car, his eyes fixed on the Carter house, as Laura Jenkins's car came to a stop at the front door. The uneasy feeling inside him grew stronger as he saw David Carter step out, his eyes cold, but his smile still maintaining the same fake politeness. He crossed his arms over his chest, presenting the image of a man with nothing to hide. But Shaq was not fooled by his appearance. The way he moved, the way he looked around as though measuring everything, like he was evaluating the person in front of him to decide which role to play, only made Shaq more certain that he was not the harmless single father he portrayed to the world. Laura got out of the car, her hair neatly tied, her sharp eyes the look of someone all too familiar with liars and concealed guilt. She walked straight to the door, wasting no time with pleasantries. "Mr. Carter, I'm Laura Jenkins with Child Protective Services. I need to speak with you about your daughter, Emily." David gave a thin smile, his eyes narrowing as if trying to figure out how much she knew. "I heard about this morning. The girl ran away and made up some crazy stories. I understand why CPS would intervene. But I'm her father, and I have the right to take her home." Laura held her calm gaze, not allowing him to steer the conversation. "We have reason to believe that Emily is not safe in this house. She will remain under our protection until the investigation is complete." David chuckled lightly, the type of laugh of a man who knows how to control a situation, but Shaq caught the subtle tension in his jaw, the way his fists clenched for a moment before he relaxed to maintain his calm facade. He exhaled slowly, as though holding back his anger. "I understand you're doing your job, but CPS has a habit of getting involved in family matters unnecessarily. I love my daughter more than anyone, and I don't think you people can decide what's best for her better than I can." Laura didn't respond, just observed him for another second before walking into the house as David reluctantly stepped aside. The moment she entered the living room, she immediately noticed something was wrong. There was no sign of an 8-year-old living here, no toys, no scribbled drawings on the walls, nothing that indicated this was a home with a child. The furniture was too pristine, everything arranged so neatly it almost felt lifeless, as if this was a show home rather than a lived-in space. But what made Laura more cautious was the strong smell of bleach still lingering in the air, a sharp, acrid scent clinging to every breath. She glanced over the rug in the middle of the living room and noticed faint stains near the edges, as if someone had tried to hide something underneath. "It seems like you've cleaned up very thoroughly," she remarked, her eyes still scanning the surroundings. David shrugged, poured himself a glass of water, and placed it on the table with a calmness honed over many years. "I'm a clean person. Everyone has their habits." Laura didn't respond, only nodded slightly and continued deeper into the house. When she reached the hallway at the back, she stopped in front of a door that was firmly shut. "Where does this door lead?" David, who had been maintaining his friendly demeanor, hesitated for a moment, a brief pause that was enough for Laura to sense he didn't want her to go any further. He tried to mask it with a smile, but his eyes were no longer as natural as before. "It leads to the basement. It's just old stuff and tools, nothing worth looking at." Laura moved closer to the door and tried turning the knob, but it was locked. "I want to check it." David's calm demeanor cracked. He stepped forward, blocking the door, his voice dropping lower, becoming colder and losing its initial feigned friendliness. "There's nothing there," he said, emphasizing each word. "You're wasting your time." Laura didn't back down, but she knew when to stop pushing. She stared at him, taking note of every detail of the conversation, from the shift in his tone to the visible tension on his face. Slowly, she stepped back, pulled out her notebook, and jotted down a few lines. "I will record this in my report." David didn't say anything further, but the atmosphere in the room became heavy, thick with unspoken tension. Laura walked out of the house, not in a hurry, but decisively. Once she reached her car, she pulled out her phone and called the CPS office. "We need to keep monitoring this case. I have a very bad feeling about that house." From a distance, Shaq watched the entire meeting through the car's window. He had been expecting such a reaction from David, but seeing his abrupt change in attitude when the basement was mentioned left Shaq with no doubts. There was something terrible being hidden beneath that house. He pulled out his phone and called Detective Mike Anders. "Mike, I just saw something really strange," Shaq said as soon as the line connected. "Go ahead." Mike's voice deepened, full of focus. "A CPS worker just met with David Carter. He remained calm until she asked to check the basement. He almost lost control when he heard that." There was silence on the other end for a few seconds before Mike spoke, slowly but with certainty. "We need a search warrant." Shaq took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on the Carter house. Something was wrong here, something no one wanted to dig into, But he knew somehow the truth would have to come out. Shaq sat in the car, his eyes still fixed on Carter's house when the low voice of Detective Mike Anders came through the phone. "I'm going to dig into David Carter's past," Mike said, his tone calm but serious. "I don't think we're dealing with an ordinary child abuse case. You can feel that, right?" Shaq nodded, his large hand tightening around the phone, his gaze cold as ice. "I'm sure he's hiding something, Mike, and we need to find out what it is before it's too late." Mike paused for a few seconds before replying. "Keep watching. I'll check back in when I have more information." Night began to fall as Shaq drove away from the neighborhood, but the uneasy feeling remained. He knew Mike was someone who could uncover the truth from the darkest corners, and if David Carter had a dark past, Anders would be the one to bring it to light. Inside the police office, fluorescent lights reflected off the computer screen as Mike Anders typed David Carter's name into the database. The system ran through a series of records before stopping at an old report, and as soon as Mike saw the first line, he knew they were right. The file revealed that David Carter had a history of domestic violence. The words on the screen seemed to chill the air in the room by a few degrees. Over 10 years ago, a woman named Lisa McCall, David's ex-girlfriend, had reported his abusive and controlling behavior. But due to lack of concrete evidence, the case was closed without any charges. Then the name Sarah Carter appeared, the wife who had gone missing a year ago. The file on Sarah simply read, "Missing, no trace." Mike leaned back in his chair, his eyes still fixed on the screen. A woman vanished without a trace, a husband with a history of violence, a terrified daughter who ran away and begged not to be brought back home. Everything was starting to piece together into a frightening picture. The next morning, Mike drove to meet Shaq. They parked outside a quiet cafe where early sunlight streamed onto the old wooden tables. When Shaq walked in, Mike pushed a file across the table toward him. "This is David Carter's past." Shaq took the file and flipped through the pages quickly, each line cutting into his intuition like a knife. When he saw Sarah Carter's name along with the words, "Missing, no trace," he looked up at Mike, his eyes full of suspicion. "No trace? You mean the police didn't investigate at all?" Mike took a deep breath and shook his head. No evidence of domestic abuse. He claimed Sarah just left, and no one could prove otherwise. She had no close relatives, no one to question it. The police logged the missing person case but never followed up. Shaq felt a simmering anger rise in his chest. "And he's still living freely like nothing happened?" Mike nodded. "Until now." Shaq clenched his fist, then placed the file on the table, his voice lowering. "We need more evidence. Someone has to know what really happened." Mike looked at him for a moment before saying, "There's someone who can help us. Someone who used to live in the Carter house." Shaq raised an eyebrow. "Who?" Mike turned to the next page of the file, revealing a black and white photo. "Emily Mitchell. She was the nanny for Emily Carter before she abruptly quit. I've found her address." Shaq looked at the photo, his eyes sharpening like someone preparing for a fight. "Let's go now." Emily Mitchell's apartment was in an old building with peeling walls and dark hallways. When Shaq and Mike reached her door, Mike knocked 3 times firmly. There was no immediate response, but after a few seconds, they heard the sound of a chain lock, and the door creaked open just a crack. A young woman with dark circles under her eyes and a face full of caution peered at them through the door. "Emily Mitchell?" Mike called gently but clearly. The girl hesitated, then nodded faintly. "We need to talk to you about David Carter." The name immediately drained the color from her face, her eyes widening as if a nightmare had just returned. "No, I can't. I don't want to get involved in this." Her voice trembled as her hand remained tightly on the door. Shaq stared into her eyes, his tone calm but convincing. "You know something, don't you? Emily Carter is in danger. If you can help us, now's the time to do what's right." Emily bit her lip, her gaze wavering between fear and hesitation. Finally, as if too exhausted from hiding the truth for so long, she silently opened the door. "When I worked for the Carter family," she began, her voice trembling but still clear, "I saw things I should never have seen." Shaq and Mike exchanged looks, knowing they had just opened the door to the truth. "David Carter isn't just an abuser," Emily said, her voice dropping to almost a whisper. "He's a monster." Shaq leaned forward, sensing that the words about to follow could change everything. He would lock Emily in her room for hours, even overnight. I'd hear her crying, begging to be let out, but he always said it was a punishment for not obeying him. Emily's voice choked as she continued. "And Sarah, she tried to leave him, but I think he didn't let that happen." Mike immediately seized on that detail. "What did you hear the night Sarah went missing?" Emily looked down at her hands, squeezing them tightly. "I heard them arguing, Sarah screaming, things breaking, and then silence." No one spoke for a few seconds. There was no need for further words. Everyone knew what had happened. Mike looked at Shaq, then back at Emily. "We need you to testify." Emily lifted her head, fear in her eyes but also a resolve. "If it helps keep Emily safe, I'll do it." Shaq clenched his jaw, the weight in his chest now taking form. Sarah Carter hadn't just gone missing. She had been murdered, and David Carter thought he had buried his secret. But he was wrong. Shaq sat still in the car, gripping his phone tightly after the conversation with Emily Mitchell ended. The heavy feeling in his chest erupted into a cold, raging fury. There was no doubt now. David Carter was an abuser, a monster, and possibly a killer. Emily Carter was carrying a fear too big because she had seen something she should never have seen. And now, it seemed that very thing had caused her mother to disappear forever. Mike Anders didn't hesitate for a second after hearing Emily Mitchell's testimony. That very day, he worked with the prosecutor's office to obtain a search warrant for the Carter house. When the judge reviewed the evidence and testimony, the warrant was granted faster than expected, as there were too many signs that this was not just a case of abuse, but potentially a murder that had been hidden for over a year. The next day, before the sun was even high, a convoy of police cars silently entered the neighborhood where David Carter lived. The patrol cars were parked along the street with their lights off to avoid drawing attention, but the simultaneous appearance of so many armed officers couldn't escape the curious gazes of the neighbors. Some peeked through their windows, while others stood on their porches with coffee in hand, wondering what was going on in this usually peaceful neighborhood. Shaq got out of the car, walked straight to the front door of the Carter house, standing like a wall between the house and the police team. He wasn't a cop, but he knew he couldn't just stand by when he could help protect Emily. The door slammed open with force, and immediately David Carter rushed out, eyes wide, face red with anger. "You don't have the right to enter my house," he shouted, his eyes darting between the armed police officers, Detective Mike Anders and Shaq, whom he recognized immediately. Shaq didn't respond right away. He simply crossed his arms over his chest, standing firm like a giant statue, his eyes calm but dangerous. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and cold, like a warning anyone could feel. "Yes, we do have the right, and you'd better be quiet." David opened his mouth to retort, but he realized immediately that he couldn't intimidate the huge man standing in front of him. He turned to Mike, his voice trembling with rage. "This is harassment. I want to talk to my lawyer." Mike, with the calm demeanor of a detective used to such theatrics, simply held up the search warrant. "We have a legal search warrant. If you have something to say, let your lawyer speak in court." David stood frozen for a few seconds, his jaw clenched, then suddenly stepped back as if to run into the house. But Shaq had anticipated this. In an instant, he extended his long arm, blocking David's shoulder, forcing him to stop immediately. He struggled, but no matter how hard he tried, he couldn't move when someone like Shaq was blocking his path. "Not so fast," Shaq muttered, his eyes still locked on David. Cornered, David could only stand there, his eyes filled with hatred as the police began to swarm into the house. Inside the Carter house, the search team began ransacking each room, drawer, and corner. Laura Jenkins, who had been in the house before, now felt the stifling atmosphere more acutely, as though the darkness in this house could swallow anyone. As one officer opened the basement door, the musty smell and another, more unpleasant odor wafted through the air, something uncomfortable, suffocating, familiar. Mike moved forward, crouching to inspect. "Get the flashlight." A beam of light swept across the basement wall, and just as the light passed over a corner of the floor, the entire team seemed to freeze. There was a faint brown stain on the concrete floor. Mike gestured for the forensic expert to enter. One person crouched down, took a chemical test strip, and dipped it into the stain. Instantly, the liquid on the strip changed color. "It's blood." No one spoke for a few seconds. Then, as if the air had been shattered, the officers began searching more vigorously. One of them knocked on a panel of wall paneling, and the sound that came out wasn't that of a solid wall. Mike immediately gestured. "Pull that panel off." Two officers used a crowbar to pry it up, and as soon as the panel was removed, a dark, empty space appeared, revealing a hidden compartment. Mike slowly stepped forward, the flashlight beam illuminating the inside. In the next moment, everything seemed to freeze. Inside the secret compartment was a large, old cloth bag, tightly bound. A torn section of the fabric revealed what was inside: a light blue jacket, Sarah Carter's jacket. Shaq stood outside, seeing the tense look on Mike's face as he emerged from the basement. "Shaq," Mike said, his voice soft but heavy, "I think we've just found something very, very wrong." Shaq didn't need to hear more. He turned his head to look at David Carter, still standing outside, his eyes frantic but mouth tightly shut. "Sarah never left, did she?" Shaq asked, his voice as deep as thunder. David didn't answer, but his panicked eyes spoke volumes. This time, Shaq didn't need to threaten. The truth was starting to come to light. The air in the basement of the Carter house was thick and heavy, as if the walls around it were absorbing all the dark secrets it had witnessed. The police moved deeper inside, their flashlights sweeping over every corner, every section of the walls, every crack on the cold concrete floor. Mike Anders crouched down, his eyes fixed on what lay beneath his feet. A worn rug that appeared to have been hastily cleaned, but not thoroughly enough to erase the past. As one of the officers yanked the rug away, a blood-stained patch of concrete was revealed, dark and splotchy from the passage of time. "Oh my God," mumbled an officer behind. The air became more suffocating than ever. Everything in the house had been meticulously cleaned to the point of suspicion, but no one could completely erase the blood. Mike signaled for the forensics team to conduct a test. As soon as the specialist took a sample for a quick test, the color on the strip changed immediately. It was blood. Mike took a deep breath, tightening his grip on the flashlight, his gaze darkening as he realized they were standing in the middle of a concealed murder scene. Just then, another officer yelled from the other side of the basement, "There's something here." Everyone rushed over, the light from their flashlights illuminating a broken phone lying amid a mess of scattered objects. Mike bent down, picked it up with a glove and turned the screen over. It was completely cracked, but when a forensic specialist tried to turn it on, the screen flickered weakly before displaying a series of unsent messages. Sender, Sarah Carter. Recipient, unknown. "I'm so scared, he's going to kill me. If I don't respond, please call the police. Please. Emily is sleeping. I can't let him hurt her. He's flipping out. I have to leave now. Help me." The final message was half-typed but never sent. Mike's hand tightened around the phone, a simmering anger rising inside him. This was no longer just a case of abuse. This was a deliberate murder. Just as Mike was about to say something, another officer called out loudly, "We found this in the locker." Everyone crowded around again. A small metal locker, its lock broken. When the police opened it, inside was an old black bag, one end slightly open, revealing a corner of dark red fabric. Mike signaled for a forensic specialist to open it carefully. As the zipper squeaked, a strong metallic odor filled the air. Inside were clothes soaked with blood, shirts, pants, and a scarf that Sarah Carter had worn in the last photo taken before she disappeared. No one spoke, but everything was clear. Mike nodded, staring at the evidence before him. Arrest warrant. Outside the Carter house, David still stood motionless, his arms tightly at his sides, his eyes darting between Shaq and the police officers. He knew this moment would come, but instead of surrendering, he laughed. A loud, distorted laugh, free of fear. When Mike stepped out of the house with a gaze as sharp as a knife, he just shrugged and sneered. "You think you can take me down just because of a pile of old junk?" Mike walked straight toward him, not bothering to hide the contempt in his eyes. "You killed Sarah Carter, and now I'll make sure you'll never have the chance to hurt anyone again." Two officers closed in, twisting David's arms behind his back. But as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists, he suddenly jerked back, roaring like a wild animal. "You can't prove anything," he screamed, struggling wildly. "Sarah left. You don't have a body. You can't convict me." But Shaq had heard enough. He stepped forward, his eyes blazing, his voice low like thunder. "No body doesn't mean you're innocent," he said, each word carved into the air. "Justice will come, and you can't escape." David Carter stopped struggling for a moment, his eyes darkening, as if realizing the game was over. The police escorted him to the patrol car, the flashing lights reflecting on his face as the door slammed shut. Shaq took a deep breath, his eyes still fixed on the car as it drove away. Sarah Carter had never disappeared. She had been murdered, and now it was time to bring her home. The interrogation room door slammed shut, leaving only a cold metal table in the space with faint yellow light flickering off the gray steel surface. David Carter leaned back in his chair, his hands cuffed in front of him, eyes scanning the small room. He had sat in rooms like this before, but this time he knew everything was different. Mike Anders entered, holding a thick stack of files. He sat down opposite David, not saying anything immediately. The silence between them became heavy, suffocating. David glanced at him, then curled his lips into a faint, crooked smile full of defiance. "I don't know what you're expecting here, Detective. I have nothing to say." Mike opened the file, slowly placing each piece of evidence on the table, as if laying out cards in a game he was certain he would win. "Blood on the concrete floor in the basement," he said, pushing the first photo toward David. "We're waiting for the DNA test results, but I bet it will match Sarah Carter's blood." David glanced at the photo and shrugged. "She used to live there. Bleeding in her own house isn't a crime." Mike said nothing, just pushed the second photo forward. The broken phone, with an unsent message from Sarah. She tried to call for help just before she disappeared. Her last message was, "He's going to kill me." This time, David's smile faltered slightly, but he still maintained his composure. "Anyone can send something like that when they're arguing. She liked to dramatize things, you know." Mike wasn't in a hurry. He watched David for a moment, as if considering how to proceed. Then he took out the final photo showing a black bag in the basement locker, inside which were Sarah's clothes soaked in dried blood. David stared at the photo, the smile completely gone from his face. Mike leaned forward, his voice low, every word sharp as a knife. "You know what happened, David. And now, I want to hear it from you." David crossed his arms over his chest and turned his face away. "I have nothing to say." Mike chuckled lightly, but there was no humor in his tone. "Actually, you do, and I think you know full well that we have enough evidence to charge you. DNA, blood, the message, the clothes, all of it points to you. The only thing missing now is the truth from you." David clenched his jaw, his hand tightening into a fist under the table, but he remained silent. Mike sighed, leaning back in his chair. "You know, if you cooperate now, maybe your lawyer can negotiate a better deal for you. But if you keep sitting here pretending you're innocent, you'll be facing the harshest sentence the law can impose. Think about it, David. Your only chance to control this situation is right now." David stayed silent for a long while. He looked down at the table, at the photos, at the irrefutable evidence surrounding him on all sides. The vein on his neck twitched, his shoulders stiffened. Then he laughed. Not a big laugh like when he was arrested, but a dry, twisted laugh, almost desperate. "You want the truth?" He looked up, his eyes darkened. "Fine, I'll give you the truth." Mike maintained his calm expression, but he could feel the tension building in the room. David leaned back in his chair, exhaling, then spoke slowly. "I didn't mean to kill her." His voice was soft, but each word cut through the air like a blade. Mike didn't respond right away. He just observed, waiting for him to continue. David swallowed, his gaze distant as though he was looking back at that fateful night. She wanted to leave. She wanted to take Emily with her. She called me a monster, said I would never change. She said she was leaving and would never come back. He tightened his fists, his nails digging into his skin. I couldn't let that happen. She was my wife. Emily was my daughter. She couldn't take her away from me. A deathly silence filled the room. "We fought," she yelled. "She pushed me. And then—" He paused, his eyes blank. I don't remember exactly. One second she was standing there, angry, screaming. The next second she was lying on the floor, her head covered in blood. She wasn't moving anymore. Mike took a deep breath, his voice lowering. "What did you do next, David?" David blinked, as if trying not to remember. "I don't know. I panicked. I cleaned up. I dragged her down to the basement. I couldn't let Emily see that. I needed time to think. But then I realized there was nothing left to think about." He looked up, his eyes empty, no trace of resistance left. "I buried her." Mike closed his eyes for a second, then opened them, his gaze sharp as a blade. "Where?" David exhaled, a strange smile flickering on his face. 50 meters from the house, in the woods behind, under a big tree." Mike immediately stood up, walking quickly out of the room, not needing to hear more. Shaq, who had been standing outside watching through the one-way mirror, slammed the door open. His eyes darkened when he saw the murderer sitting motionless. Mike glanced at Shaq, his voice cold as ice. "We found Sarah." No one said anything more. There was nothing left to say. The truth had finally come to light. The forest behind Carter's house was eerily quiet, with the early morning sunlight filtering through the trees and casting its rays onto the ground covered in decaying leaves. The air was crisp, but for the police officers present, nothing could mask the heavy atmosphere that hung over the area. Mike Anders stood at the edge of the woods, his eyes following the movements of the forensic team. They were meticulously scanning every inch of the ground, every tree stump, using David Carter's confession to locate where Sarah Carter's body had been hidden. Shaq stood not far off, arms crossed, his jaw clenched as he watched the police work. He never imagined he'd be caught up in a case like this, but now, nothing would make him leave until the truth was revealed. A shout came from afar. "We found something here." Everyone immediately moved toward the indicated area. A forensic specialist was crouched next to a large tree where the soil seemed to have been disturbed earlier. A shovel was brought in, and after a few careful digs, an old piece of fabric appeared beneath the wet earth. The atmosphere suddenly grew even heavier. No one said anything, but everyone knew what was waiting beneath the surface. After several minutes of careful excavation, the forensic team pulled up a body wrapped in a tarpaulin. The victim's body had decomposed severely, but the skull was still intact, with a deep crack running from the temple to the back of the head. Mike clenched his fist as he looked down at the body just unearthed. Sarah Carter had been here for over a year, buried in the silence of the forest, forgotten by those who only believed the lies of her husband. The cause of death appears to be a severe blow to the head, a forensic expert said, his voice professional but tinged with the gravity of the situation. "We'll take the body back for further examination." At that moment, another officer shouted from the edge of the search area, "We found something." Everyone turned around, and as they moved closer, they saw a rusty metal bar lying beneath a layer of dead leaves. Traces of dried blood were still visible on the metal surface, despite the time that had passed. Mike signaled the forensic team to collect the sample. "We need to test for DNA immediately." A forensic specialist carefully picked up the metal bar with rubber gloves and placed it into an evidence bag. "If this is the murder weapon, we'll definitely find David Carter's DNA on it." Shaq stood motionless, his eyes fixed on the rusty bar. the weapon that had ended the life of an innocent woman. A wave of anger surged within him, but he knew this was not the time for emotional reactions. Mike stepped up beside Shaq, his voice low but firm. "We've got him." Shaq nodded, his gaze no longer simply one of anger. It was a commitment to ensure that Monster would never have the chance to hurt anyone again. They had found Sarah Carter, and now justice would speak. The courtroom was packed with people. The air was thick with tension, and every eye was fixed on David Carter, who sat at the defendant's table in an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands shackled, his face gaunt, but still attempting to maintain an air of coldness and indifference. But this time, there was no fake smile, no smugness, only a defeated man facing a fate he could not escape. In the row behind, Shaquille O'Neal sat silently, his hand tightly gripping his knee, feeling the powerful thump of his heartbeat in his chest. Before him, on the witness stand, Emily Carter, only 8 years old, stood straight, her small voice soft but clear as it rang out in the courtroom. I miss my mom," Emily began, her voice breaking but her eyes determined. "She told me we were going to leave, but then Dad got angry. I heard them arguing. I heard Mom scream. Then there was nothing else." The room fell silent, so quiet you could hear every breath. Everyone in the courtroom held their breath, listening to each word from the little girl, as if each sentence were a knife cutting into the truth. "Mom never came back," Emily continued, her eyes filled with tears but her resolve unshaken. "Dad said she left, but I know that's a lie. I know Mom would never leave me like that." Shaq swallowed hard, struggling to keep his composure as he looked at the little girl standing there, small yet stronger than anyone else in the room. He remembered the moment when she had knocked on his car window, begging not to go back home, recalling the terrified tears and how she had clung to his hand, seeking protection. And now, she was no longer running away. She was facing the monster who had destroyed her family. On the defendant's side, David Carter sat motionless, his gaze darkening as he heard his daughter accuse him in court. There had been a time when he controlled everything, when he could silence every accusation, manipulate people with his lies. But now, he had nothing left. The prosecutor stepped forward, her voice stern. "Emily, can you tell the court how you felt living with your father?" Emily pressed her lips together, took a deep breath, then answered, I'm always scared. I never know when Dad will get angry. I can't talk, I can't play, I can't cry. I can only stay quiet and hope that Dad doesn't get mad at me." A sob escaped from the public gallery. Someone had broken down in tears. The prosecutor nodded to Emily, her gaze full of respect. "You're very brave, Emily. Thank you for telling the truth." The little girl nodded softly, then turned her head to look at Shaq. Her eyes brightened when she saw him, as if she had found a familiar anchor in this strange and frightening space. Shaq forced a smile, though his eyes were red. The judge banged his gavel, his voice stern. "The jury has reached a verdict. They have found the defendant, David Carter, guilty of second-degree murder and child abuse." A heavy silence filled the room as the judge continued. "Given the severity of the case, the court sentences the defendant, David Carter, to life in prison without the possibility of parole." A wave of relief spread through the courtroom. There was no applause, no cheers, only deep, emotional sighs and red eyes as justice was finally served. David sat still, his face blank as the words of the sentence echoed in his head. He had lost everything. No one believed his lies anymore. There was no escape. Shaq closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them, looking at Emily. She had done it. She had faced her greatest fear and overcome it. When the trial ended, Shaq stepped forward, bending down next to Emily. She looked at him, then ran into his arms, holding him tight as if never wanting to let go. "Thank you, Mr. Shaq," she whispered. Shaq gently squeezed her in his large arms, his voice deep, sincere, but full of emotion. "It's nothing, kid. You did everything that needed to be done. You were so strong." Emily nodded, and for the first time in a long while, a small smile appeared on her face. In the distance, David Carter was escorted by the police, his gaze cold and empty. But no one looked at him anymore. He no longer mattered. Today, justice had prevailed. But, more importantly, Emily Carter had found her way to move forward. The afternoon sun cast a warm layer of light down on the quiet street where the Parker house stood. The small but cozy house, with its white picket fence and garden full of vibrant flowers, radiated a sense of peace, a stark contrast to the gloom and heaviness of the Carter house from before. Here, there were no shadows lurking behind closed doors. Here, Emily could finally breathe a sigh of relief. The Parker family was a foster family for children in difficult circumstances. They weren't rich, but they had love. The kind of love Emily had been missing throughout her childhood. From the first day she walked in, she felt the difference. There was no longer the fear of every glance or every voice, no more haunting nights spent awake, too afraid to make a sound. Mrs. Parker, a gentle woman with graying hair and a kind smile, welcomed Emily with warm arms. "Welcome home, Emily." Those words made Emily burst into tears. But they weren't tears of fear. They were tears from a child who had finally felt safe. As time went on, Emily gradually adapted to her new life. She began to laugh more, sleep better, and slowly forgot the terrifying days that had passed. Every morning, she woke up to the smell of pancakes from the kitchen, and every afternoon, she played on the grass with the other kids in the neighborhood. But even as she started a new life, Emily never forgot the one who saved her that day, the one who stopped when she ran away, the one who believed her when no one else did. One afternoon, while Emily was drawing in the living room, the doorbell rang. She jumped off the couch and ran to the door. When Mrs. Parker opened it, a large figure stood there, a familiar face Emily could never forget. Shaquille O'Neal. He was still the same, tall and strong, but his eyes softened with tenderness as he saw Emily. Before Shaq could say anything, Emily ran straight to him and hugged him tightly. "Shaq!" she cried, her little arms squeezing him as if afraid he would disappear if she let go. Shaq bent down, his strong arms gently enveloping her, a smile spreading across his face as he felt her no longer trembling like before. Emily looked up, her eyes filled with tears, but this time her smile was brighter than ever. "Thank you for believing in me," she said, her voice choked with emotion. Shaq slowly knelt to her level, placing his hands on her small shoulders. "I believed in you from the very first moment, kiddo," he said, his voice warm, "and I'll always be here whenever you need me." Emily nodded, her eyes sparkling. She was no longer the scared little girl who had knocked on his car window that fateful morning. Now, she was stronger, more confident, and most importantly, she knew she was no longer alone. Shaq ruffled her hair, then handed her a small box. I have a gift for you." Curious, Emily opened it, and inside was a mini basketball signed by him. But that wasn't all. Beneath the ball was a special ticket. A ticket to an NBA game where Shaq would be a guest of honor. Her eyes widened in surprise, and then she burst into laughter, a clear, joyful laugh Shaq had never heard before. "You're amazing," she exclaimed. Shaq laughed heartily. "I know, but you're the amazing one here." Mrs. Parker stood beside them, tears welling up in her eyes as she watched the scene before her. No one in the room needed to say anything more. Everything was already clear. Emily had finally found a family, and Shaq knew that whenever she needed him, he would always be there. Shaq crouched down, placing his hands firmly on Emily's shoulders. His gaze was gentle but full of pride as he looked at her. "You're very strong, Emily. You're safe now." Emily looked up at him, her eyes filled with gratitude. There was no trace of fear in her gaze anymore, no sign of the child who used to hide from terror. Now she stood tall, no longer a victim, but a survivor, a warrior who had overcome the darkness to find the light. Shaq gently ruffled her hair and smiled kindly. "I'll come back to visit you, but I want you to promise me one thing." Emily nodded firmly. "What is it?" Shaq looked directly into her eyes, his voice warm yet certain. "Always believe in yourself. You've overcome the worst, and now you can do anything you want. Live happy and strong because that's the best way to prove that no one can snuff out the light inside you." Emily smiled, her eyes sparkling. "I promise." Shaq chuckled, then nodded approvingly. "Good job, kiddo." He stood up, waved goodbye to Mrs. Parker, who looked at him with deep respect. "Thank you, Shaq. Thanks to you, Emily can start over." Shaq shook his head as he walked toward the door. "No, Mrs. Parker, she saved herself. I just helped her find the way." As Shaq stepped out of the Parker home, a gentle breeze blew through, carrying the scent of a peaceful afternoon. He paused in front of his Cadillac Escalade, taking a deep breath and feeling a rare sense of relief fill his chest. He had experienced many glorious moments on the basketball court, high-stakes games, championship titles, and the loud cheers of thousands of fans. But no moment could compare to this feeling, the feeling of knowing that he had truly made a difference in someone's life. As he sat in the driver's seat, he looked in the rearview mirror and saw Emily standing at the door, waving at him with a radiant smile, like sunshine. He smiled back, started the engine, and slowly drove down the narrow road. Some heroes are made on the playing field. Some heroes appear in movies and in fantastical stories. But sometimes a hero isn't someone in a cape or someone who scores spectacular points. Sometimes a hero is simply someone who knows when to stop, listen, and believe in a child. Because a small act can change a person's life. Because justice always wins. And because Shaquille O'Neal doesn't just know basketball, he's a true hero. Shaquille O'Neal and Emily Carter's story is not just a tense crime-solving journey, but also a testament to the power of kindness, trust, and justice. One small act, stopping the car, listening, and believing, completely changed a child's life. In the end, David Carter received his just punishment. Emily found a true home, and Shaq proved that heroes don't only appear on the basketball court, but also in the important moments of life. What do you think of this story? If you encountered a similar situation, what would you do? Leave your thoughts in the comments. If you like this story, don't forget to like, share to spread the meaningful message, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next inspiring stories.